The views and opinions expressed in The Fact Is with Hollis Grant are those of Hollis Grant and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Droids Canada Network. Droids Canada Network does not take responsibility for any content or position produced by Hollis Grant and his show. Listener discretion is advised.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for tuning in to another edition of The Fact Is. I'm your host, Hollis Grant, and on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the political parties that are running for office in the Ontario provincial election, which will be on June 2nd. Currently, it's our good friend, Doug Ford, who is holding office, and he's done a subpar job. Ontario has the largest sub-sovereign debt in the entire world, outspending the state of California. Doug Ford initially ran on a campaign to cut back on provincial spending, to bring back that debt levels. Well, unfortunately, in the last 4 years, he did suffer a little bit of a world hiccup in COVID, but nonetheless has continued to outspend the Ontario Liberals of the last 14 years. Now what we're going to do is take a look at each political party, and right now there's 4 major parties with the offshoot of a 5th, which is the Green Party, and it's something that we're not going to discuss as they're not really relevant in Ontario politics. So first up, we're going to start from the far left, the New Democratic Party of Ontario. Now, what's wonderful about the New Democratic Party is their website. And if you're a person that has trouble sleeping at night, as any type of insomnia, I highly recommend going to ontariondp.ca/platform. You can click on the plethora of panels to read. And by far, by any political party, it is the longest, pointless paragraphs that you will ever read. And we decided here that we'd look at some silliness that they talk about. Now, part of their plan, just to go over, is making life more affordable, fixing our healthcare system, fixing home care and long-term healthcare, helping Ontarians age in place, good jobs that pay the bills, fixing education in schools, climate, jobs, justice, the Green New Democratic Deal, fixing Ontario's social safety net and ensuring people with disabilities live a great life. And the list goes on. These are just a few. Now, my favorite on theirs is equity. You hear a lot of talk, especially if you're listening in the United States, you hear a lot of talk about equity. Now, a few years ago, it was about equality and everybody being treated equal. Now, equity is taking things a step further, meaning that equity has the same outcome. So everyone has the same opportunity, and they have the same outcome from that opportunity. Now, I'm going to read from the equity tab. I won't read all of it, because this would be a 3-hour program, and I don't think we want to go down the 3 hours of reading this and have you fall asleep. So, from their equity tab, everyone in Ontario deserves to feel safe, welcome, at home in this province we all share. No one should have to face or fear hate, violence, and harassment because of the color of their skin, their faith, their gender, or their sexual orientation. For Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in Ontario, racism and discrimination is far too often a daily reality and a maze of deeply ingrained systemic barriers. Additionally, in recent years, Ontario, along with the rest of Canada, has seen a rise in organized white supremacist hate, along with rising tide of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, and anti-Indigenous racism. Now, to speak about the rise, in quotes, rise of white supremacist hate, that would be incorrect. See, there is a rise of attacks of anti-Semitism. That much is true, and that's supported by the Free Palestine movement or the Palestinian movement. There was a recent example from 2 years ago at a protest with a Jewish man being beaten with a wooden 2x4. There are Al-Quds Day marches, and that's happened throughout the city of Toronto. And in terms of anti-Asian racism, there was the Middle Eastern family that accused a Asian man of coming up and cutting a little girl's hijab, to which the Prime Minister condemned the attack, and only hours later came out that the little girl lied about the whole thing and made everything up. There is an example of a Miss Khan in Mississauga who said that she was attacked in broad daylight. She was put down on a curb and her face was stomped into the curb. She was beaten in broad daylight in a shopping center in the city of Mississauga, all to which there are no accounts, there is no video, and it was false. It was made up. When it comes down to anti-Indigenous racism, the Indigenous people of Ontario almost have a free pass to loot and destroy. Case in point, the city of Caledonia, where a bunch of Indians decided that their land was being built on by a developer. The native locals went in and demolished the new housing project, and they also did beat some locals. And the Ontario Provincial Police were ordered to stand down, and this was under the Dalton McGuinty Liberal government of the day, and were ordered to stand down and not to help civilians being attacked by gangs of Indians beating up people. On the Six Nation Reserve out in Brantford by the city of Oswego, there has been numerous church burnings. In fact, I have personally counted 6 church buildings, and I have not been to all of the reserve, and that's only in recent times where that occurred. What was wonderful about those church burnings, and even from the people in the reserve, have noted that even non-Catholic church were burned down to the ground. And this is all coming from the stem of the children, quote-unquote children, being found at residential schools on Catholic grounds. So there are no examples of anti-Indigenous. The leftist parties use this type of rhetoric to whip up an emotion, to whip up and drive emotion in people so that they vote with emotion. There are no solutions. I can go on and read this entire article and it will address nothing. It will talk about no solution. It will talk about how we need to stop all these evils. And just to scroll through a little further down, we'll read a little bit more. For years, Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to take concrete, ongoing action to address the crisis of systemic discrimination, racism, white supremacy, and organized hate. The Ford government has only made things worse, cutting Ontario anti-racism directorate, dismantling its working groups, and looking the other way as organized hate continues to spread. For years, communities facing both structural and discrimination and hate have been clear. Political leaders must move beyond words to concrete, meaningful action to tear down systemic racism and eradicate white supremacy and all forms of hate in Ontario. An Ontario NDP government will make the investments and to do the work to dismantle structural racism in every sector in Ontario and push back against the rising tide of hate informed by the lived experiences of and in collaboration with Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities, as well as Muslims and Jewish communities. Now, further down, it goes on to their commitment. Take urgent action to dismantle white supremacist groups in Ontario. Over 300 alt-right or white supremacist groups are reported as operating in Canada, many of them active in Ontario. Commitment. Take on white supremacists, alt-right extremists, and other organized hate groups within the provincial strategy to address racism by removing their abilities to operate in the province, such as prohibiting them from registering as non-profits in Ontario. But it does not address issues such as Islamist groups. Nowhere in their platform does it address Islamists. In the city of Mississauga, which is a very high proportion of Middle Eastern immigrants, has been at the center of a few Islamist attacks. Plans. There was a recent mosque that was shut down and lost its funding for providing charity funds to groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. You had a terrorist plot was stopped, and they were living in a home in Mississauga. There was the train attack that was planned, and that was happened in Mississauga as well, where some terrorists were going to blow up sections of the railway system used for commuter trains. Now, moving on to the Liberal Party of Ontario, theirs is a lot less reading, some really fancy graphics, some really interesting pictures of their leader staring off into space, looking like he's paying attention as he stands and plants to appear to be like a common working guy. Now, in his particular platform, there's this wonderful idea of build to a 4-day work week. And I quote, "During the pandemic, you showed remarkable flexibility and resolve in embracing new ways of doing work. Adopting a 4-day work week would be another change, but one that experts say could boost your quality of life and work-life balance without a loss in productivity. We'll work with businesses and labor groups of all types to design and evaluate the model. If a 4-day work week demonstrates potential in Ontario, people could have many more, quote, family day weekends, extra time to invest their well-being and spend with loved ones." It's a fantastic idea. Let's do a 4-day work week in a 24-hour economy. You have an economy that requires people going out and to consume. You are going to say, well, we're going to pick 4 days to shut down. Now, in those 4 days, does that mean I have to work more hours in a day? What about my health? What about daycare? Children going to school? Well, which day would they be off? If teachers are going to be off now for 3 days, well, businesses would have to put people off 3 days. But then you need to get your products out to market. Well, how do you do that if it's shortened down? So now you're forcing people to work 10-hour days. Well, shouldn't a business be open at any time? The reason why that Ontario went to a 7-day work week was back in the 80s, a Jewish jeweler was the one to challenge what days can be closed, because malls could be open on Saturday, but they couldn't be open on Sunday. And his argument was their holy day is not Sunday, it's Saturday. So Jewish people are actually out and can't operate Saturday and Sunday because their holy day is Saturday and they can't open their store, whereas non-Jewish people could be open Saturday and closed on the Sunday because the holy day would be the Sunday. In that case was one. So they opened the economy up for 7 days a week, and that's why we have Sunday shopping. Well, how would private sector react to this? To be closed down 3 days, to be forced to close down for 3 days? The Ontario Liberal Party had a majority with the last election. Through corruption and mismanagement for the last 14 years, billions of dollars have been missing. They were decimated down to a party of only 6 seats, enough that all their members could take one minivan to work. With this particular platform and how they're going about, it's looking to be more or less the same for this election. The NDP are hardly going to hold any seats as well. So that leaves us to Doug Ford. Well, let's go back to what our good friend Doug Ford once said. Now, taking you back for this particular clip was during COVID, and just as COVID started in the summer. Now, I'll play the clip for you. It's about a minute and a half long, and just in case you haven't heard it. So let's hear what our good friend Doug Ford has to say.
Currently, right now, outside of Queen's Park, where you're located, there is a protest with about 100 folks who are calling for the end of the lockdown here in this province and across this country. What message do you have to people who are not taking this seriously, but also who could be not adhering to social and physical distancing protocols?
Well, that's a great question. You know, when I looked out the window and we see these people that are absolutely irresponsible. It's reckless to do what they're doing. And personally, I think it's selfish. We have healthcare workers down the street at these hospitals working around the clock to protect the community. 99.9% of the people in this province are working together, side by side. That's the reason we were able to see a flattening of the curve. But then we have, a bunch of yahoos out in the front of Queen's Park sitting there protesting that the place isn't open, as they're breaking the law and putting everyone in jeopardy, putting themselves in jeopardy, putting the workers in jeopardy, and God forbid one of them end up in the hospital down the street.
Now, it's worth noting that there are still COVID restrictions in Canada. There are COVID restrictions upon entry by air. There are COVID restrictions entry by land. Unvaccinated people can still not travel by plane, and they cannot travel by train, and they're not allowed to travel by boat. Unvaccinated people cannot leave the country. They can move freely within it, but they cannot go outside of it. So there are still restrictions. There are still restrictions at the federal level, but in the provincial level, most of those restrictions have ended. But health officials, and we've covered this on past episodes of Droids Canada, you can follow the whole history of COVID as it comes down, as it happened at droidscanada.com. But what's interesting, these doctors in the Health Advisory Board were still calling for Doug Ford to keep the restrictions in place. There are still public health officials that do not want an open return to normal, but they still want to have the vaccine passports in place, and they still want to have these mandates in place. Now, Doug Ford was put in a position to end the mask mandates, all types of mandates, and he did so against his own advisory panel to saying, keep the mandates. So at that point in time, he did not listen to, quote-unquote, the science, like the people that he was referring to. Those, and I'll quote, bunch of yahoos that were protesting were not listening to those doctors and had issues with what was being done. Fast forward 2 years later, and Doug Ford does not listen to his advisors. So is Doug Ford now a yahoo himself? And finally, our last political party is a new party called the New Blue Party. They're an offshoot of upset conservatives that started their own political party during the pandemic. It's started by two people, Jim Carhilios and his wife, who is currently a MP of Cambridge, in the city of Cambridge. Now we have to give some bonus points for the New Blue Party, or newblueontario.com, because they have a nice little cheer on theirs. And I'll read this here for you. Doug Ford PCs, they love liberals, lockdowns, and lobbyists. They aren't blue, and they aren't for you. It's time for something new, and it's time for something blue. Let us stand up for you with the New Blue. Now, we here on the show, we love poetry, and we give them full marks for attempting some type of poetry. But it really does lack a lot of creativity, rhyming you and blue multiple times. There are better words to use. We highly would recommend taking a look at some skilled songwriters, some skilled poets, and coming up with something a little bit more than a childish cheerleading gimmick. Now, to note, we here on the show did reach out to the New Blue Party to get some further information and have a chat with some local candidates. So I want to give a great shout out to our man, Gary Damelie, at Gary, Dumelie, on Twitter. If you want to reach out with this wonderful person. Now, we reached out to him on his Twitter, sent him a message. We want to learn a little bit more about your party. Let's hear what you have to offer. Let's hear what this New Blue Party has to offer. Unfortunately, Gary didn't bother to even answer. And we do want to thank and acknowledge those other candidates that did reach out to us, and we thank you. But Gary, if you're going to represent the people, you need to answer the people when they come calling. Because if you were elected, you didn't even care for somebody in your own riding to talk to. Well, we speculate here that he was trying to come up with a new blue cheer. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to this edition of The Fact Is. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time. I'm your host, Hollis Grant.
Dan, what happens every Thursday?
That would be DCR Droids Canada Radio.
And what time is it at on Thursday?
That's from 9 till 11 p.m.
Dumb question. Where do you find it?
You find that at accessradio.ca.
And what's the best part?
It's